Ready for class? I didn't do it.
How was everyone else's Thanksgiving? You don't do Thanksgiving? Or some part of your family that it's like. I see it's a super American holiday, right? So if you're from an immigrant family, why is it not a big thing? Although you know, it depends. Some families have it
Nah,
integrated the holiday, but no, not your family. It's not a thing.
we just cook for fun.
Okay.
Family.
Yeah, yeah.
But no.
Oh, little fusion. Yeah.
I don't know about that one. I don't know about that one.
That might be not to do with something. Turkey and chicken.
See, because we try turkey mole.
Oh.
That was not good. That was not good. That was not good.
That's a bummer.
No, didn't work.
I would think it's only on just about anything.
Yeah, right.
That's what we thought too, but didn't work. We still ate it, but no. We stay away from it now. Like the whole family agreed it wasn't good.
Anybody else?
On Wednesday. She was arranging the house, you know, and little something, I don't know what she did, so they got power until Sunday. It started. That's all I can do. Oh, well.
Well, welcome to week 15, our final week together. So this is our last session. Next week, final week, having in-person finals. Today is the day. On our agenda, we will check in on what your tasks are this week. We'll talk a little bit about the Golden Bird reading on English language learners and pre-K to 12th grade classrooms. The things that it does and doesn't have to say about what's supportive for those students. Then we're also going to return to our assumptions about language learning.
Before we continue, so on the sixth, we're coming or not coming? Yeah, not
Okay. Because so technically Monday should be the last day of classes, and after that, the final exam schedule starts. So final exams are scheduled at different times depending on when their typical class meeting would happen, not necessarily during their typical class meeting. So for this class, it's final, you don't need it all. You just submit the question. Yeah. And then, so we'll do an activity again where we're going to return to the very first week of this class. You completed a sort of questionnaire giving your opinion on some statements about language. And you wrote a discussion board post way back then. But what we're going to do is complete the same questionnaire and see if you notice that some of your thinking may have changed or not about language. And whatnot. So that's the agenda. So, as you know, your final exam is available. It's due Tuesday, not Monday. Tuesday night, 11:59, December. Your end of semester course evaluations are also available. Please do those before they close on Monday night, the 5th of December. It really doesn't give important helpful feedback to me on this class as well as the department on this class. We do encourage that for future. Also, if you haven't registered for your classes in spring, no.
I have a hold of my class. I've been trying to register. I have been dying to register.
Are you talking to the right people about it?
Yeah.
Damn, they never help. They never help.
I know. Sometimes, honestly, too, going to your academic advisor and getting them involved in the process can be helpful. If you're not getting what you need, go that route. Even honestly, like in your elementary education,
Yeah.
sometimes even going to your advisor over there. Any of these people sometimes can get involved and help advocate for you to make sure that happens.
Register from day one.
Sure. Yeah, honestly, I would start casting a wide net and talk to all of those people. One of them will be able to get you there. If there are courses with very low enrollment, it's possible they would get. I don't say that to scare anyone, but just if anyone's sort of sitting on the fence thinking, maybe I'll take this class or that class, go ahead and register for it before they start coming through with the machete. I can see in Tony classes that have two people.
What's the threshold to the class?
I think for a long time it was 8, and I think now it's actually more like 5 or 6. I'm still around that 4. But that's not a great situation. So if you have friends in the program, you're like, I really need to take this class, and it's kind of low. Can you please register? That can happen.
Then the graduation.
All the numbers are pretty low right now.
We're getting ready for graduation. Student union.
I mean, in December graduation is always a little bit lower than May.
Not when I started working.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't know what a typical year has been, like with the
It's like-
pandemic shifts.
Yeah. When I started working back in 2018, first graduation year was we had two sessions. And that's a lot. We went to 2 sessions. Then 2019, when the pandemic hit, came back, it was like 1 session. And even for summer, it was only 1 session. It was like, wow.
Well, for your own sakes, go ahead and register. So in terms of the final exam, so we talked about it last week. I just wanted to say, yeah, please make sure you read the directions carefully. Look at that hypothetical example that's on the instruction sheet. Make sure you include all the information that's required. Do you have questions? Like,
I neglected everything. I'm not gonna lie to you. It was one of those weekends.
That's okay. You've got, a full week from now and then next week. A full week and several hours to work on it. It does need to be turned in on time. The turnaround time for submitting the final grade is pretty short, so I can't have to submitting that, days later. It just won't work. So please make sure to prioritize submitting it on time. If you do think of questions later that you are hoping I might be able to answer, go ahead and email me, call me, meet with me for office hours. All of those are available to you. I'd be more than happy to talk to you about it. It actually is super important that you do complete that course evaluation. I think as of yesterday, 5 out of 8 have completed it. So that means 3 of you have not yet, unless you did it in the last 4 hours. So the link is in your email and you can access it as well. Is anyone not sure how to get to it? Okay, it just is there. Okay. So I'll say, and your responses on those are completely anonymous. I can never tell who said what. So don't be concerned about saying something critical. It's actually really helpful for me if you feel like this part of the course was not that helpful, or this part was especially challenging in a way that wasn't great. That won't hurt my feelings, and I won't know it was you. So please go ahead and include that feedback. I wouldn't see any of the information until after final grades are posted. And again, even then, it's completely anonymous. And could you take a screenshot of whatever it shows that you completed your evaluation and then just send it to me as an email? So nothing of the content of the evaluation, but usually after you finish, it says like, thank you. Or if you have already done it, you can go back into it and it'll show that it is completed. Take a screenshot just of that and send it to me. And I will just count that as your discussion board video and whatever else I might have given you this week. That's it. Just do your course stuff.
Mine's done.
Great. So just go into D2L, take a screenshot showing that it's finished, email that to me. Yeah? Okay. There you go. What if you do both?
Extra credit.
So they're actually, I thought about it and I was like, I'm actually gonna let you have the time to focus on just working on your final exam. And instead of giving you, like I said, video and discussion board, there isn't one of those for this week. It's just completing your course stuff. Okay.
That's not fair for him. He did the homework.
Like,
I didn't.
there isn't.
Thinking about last week.
Not for week 15, for week 14, I said it. Yeah, but so there is that one. But it's the easiest 2 points you'll ever get. You can even be like, I made it this plan. So,
It is. That's ever so much fun.
oh, I'm glad you thought so. Well, even if you didn't, go ahead and put that into the evaluation. Then take that screenshot. Everyone knows how to do that. I'm not sure. I don't want to do something that you're like,
I'm like, where is it? I see it. Where is it? Maybe it's in a
and you should be able to access it from in D2L, like,
Yeah, that's all right now.
there's a thing that says course evaluation. I think it might look a little bit different for you, but it should be in this, like, all here, go down. Something about your. Well, then just take a screenshot of that because that proves to me you have done it. That is enough. If it says no survey, that means you're done. Okay.
And then money or.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so then, our topic for this week was that Goldberg reading that was titled "What the Research Does and Does Not Say About Teaching English Language Learners." And as many of you will be going on to teach ELL in pre-K to 12th grade classrooms, this reading sort of grounds us firmly into the important takeaways about that sort of particular age group of students and what the research does and doesn't say about how those students are served in pre-K to 12th grade classrooms. But a lot of this is also very applicable to teaching adults as well. So don't sort of tune out if you're not planning on teaching grade school kids. The most controversial issue that Goldberg addressed was this kind of very primary question that there tends to be a lot of disagreement or different thinking about, which is whether instruction should be exclusively in the L2, the target language, in this case English, or if whether instruction should be in both first language and the L2, the target language. We talked about that a lot over the course of this semester because a lot of the methods that we looked at address that differently. So which methods can you think of welcomed some amount of L1 in the classroom? Some amount or all of them? It isn't like if there was a role for the first language in the classroom, which method allowed for a role for the first language? Grammar translation is a key one. And what was sort of the role of the first language in a grammar translation? Yeah, you were often translating from the first language to the target language or the other way, from L2 back to the L1, and mostly in reading and writing, right? Mostly documents, literature, but often very sort of classical literature. What other methods can you think of including the L1 in the classroom and some role for the L1? Desuggestivpedia, yeah, definitely. What role did the first language play in that sort of context? It was a way to figure out another role. They role play. They also use grammar translation. Yeah, it was important for them to give instructions in there. Yeah. Exactly. So sort of giving instructions to get the class started, to explain, here's what we're doing in this activity. And then when they started the orchestral reading, that would be in the second language. Do you remember also in the reading that they would do, that maybe you would take some notes in the first language or provide translation of like the scripts in both the target language and the first language. So yeah, desuggestivpedia is another. Can you think of what were some methods we've looked at this semester that had no role for the first language? The first language is not welcome. Direct method. Yeah. Can you explain maybe why? Why was that? The reason they were using that to avoid yeah, so the idea was maybe that first language kind of gets in the way. And so with direct method, they said, let's set it aside completely. And rather than offering translation from first language to second language, instead of saying cat, gato, and providing sort of L1 equivalent, it would just be picture of a cat or maybe an actual cat. This idea that we communicate to students directly the meaning of this word without letting the first language get in the way or get involved in it, right? We think of other methods we looked at this semester that have no role for the L1. Audiolingual is another, yes, where why was that the case in audiolingual Yeah, so audiolingual has had a very strong focus on listening and speaking skills and pronunciation specifically. It's very, very important that students learn to pronounce words correctly right from the first. And remember that audiolingual, the basis of that method was really in behavioral psychology, or the idea that learning is really about habit formation. So the more we repeat something, that we build our language habits. And so we want to kind of get out of the habits of the first language, develop new language habits in the target language, and therefore there's no real role for the first language if we're just focusing on a lot of repetition and habit formation. So, and we could give more examples from many of the methods we looked at this semester. Most of the sort of more modern communicative language teaching methods that we looked at kind of later in the semester have some role for the first language. Sometimes in terms of giving classroom instructions, sometimes in providing translation of key vocabulary, sometimes, you know, sort of resorting to the first language only when communication is kind of totally broken down and we need it as a sort of assist to get back on track in the part. Goldberg talks in his article about a meta-analysis of 17 different studies. So meta-analysis, that means sort of like each of these studies was an analysis. It was looking at reading instruction. And meta-analysis means they sort of looked at all of the data from these 17 different studies on reading instruction that took place over 35 years. And those studies were all looking at reading instruction that either uses the student's first and second language, so sort of bilingual reading instruction, and L2 immersion reading instruction, or teaching English reading only in English with no role for the first language. Okay, so these studies looked at how did these students compare when being taught to read in English only or English as their first language as well. Okay, and this meta-analysis looking at these 17 different studies over 35 years found that teaching English language learners to read in their first language and then in their second language, or in their first and second languages simultaneously at the same time, maybe at different times during the day, but in the same sort of life moment of that, let's say, kindergartner, compared with teaching them to read in their second language only. It was found that the first time, teaching students to read in both first and second language boosts their achievement in the second language. That's kind of a hard sentence to understand. So I'm going to try to break it down. And we did talk about this a little bit last week when we were talking about generation 1.5. But basically, the first group is students who are learning to read in L1 and L2 at the same time, or learning to read in L1, then L2. Okay, this is group number 1. Group number 2 is being taught to read only in L2, right? And these studies all found that the overall sort of conclusion that was drawn was that this group actually learned to read better in L2 than the group that was only learning in L2. To say nothing of how well they learned to read in their first language, right? But that's important because the argument for a long time had been that this group will go faster. This group will get better outcomes in their reading because the L1 sort of strategy that we are advising or or ignoring reading in the L1, so that these students are just learning to read in English alongside English-speaking peers, right? But the research sort of disproved that tremendously by showing that this first group of students who were learning to read both in L1 and L2 at the same time, or got to learn to read in L1 first, then L2, actually did better in reading L2 in the long run. Is that surprising to you? It's not.
No.
Why not?
Literacy is foundational for this. So I actually just observed a classroom that has a bilingual teacher, but she cannot use her Spanish as often. She has to basically use English first most of the time. And that student is a newcomer and is not proficient in his first language and can't read it. Sure. And she's really concerned because in her 21 years, that's never worked out. So she doesn't even need these studies to help.
She knows instinctively
Yeah.
how that's going to go.
But so I had a question about adult learners, because I'm assuming this is all about kids.
That's right.
Okay, so is it the same in adult learners here?
Like if you had an adult student who hadn't developed literacy in their first
Well,
language.
let's just say maybe they got to like third grade.
Okay, sure. I don't know if that's a great question. I'm not sure what the research says. My strong suspicion is that it would hold up for adult learners if those adult learners were given the opportunity. I mean, I feel like even their third grade reading level is still going to give them quite a leg up in terms of developing literacy in the second language.
But they'll only be able to take it up to a certain level.
I don't think that's true necessarily. I think the transfer of their skills, even just third grade reading skills, that they'll be able to bring over to learning to read in English, will boost them. And I think they would be able to build beyond third grade level in English, even if they had sort of stopped there. I think if perhaps given the opportunity to build their literacy beyond third grade, simultaneously with building literacy in English, I think that would probably be the best outcome for that.
The reason I ask is not too long ago, actually, I had an adult talking to me about taking ESL classes, but she said she didn't have confidence that she'd be able to be successful because she didn't finish grade school in her country.
Yeah.
So, and I was wondering about that.
If anything, I feel like the impacts would be more affective, right? I think that her potential sort of inhibitions or fears around not being good enough or not being able to learn, not being smart, that kind of thing would be greater barriers than actually being able to learn beyond her, what opportunity she had for education in childhood. It's true that as one gets older, learning more broadly can be slower, right? Not just with language, but with anything, right? But I think if those when we talk about the sort of affective filter and that sort of idea, I think of those things as like motivation, like a rich environment with a lot of language and comprehensible input. And that's not just speaking and listening, that's reading and writing as well in terms of comprehensible input. And if that self-esteem or that confidence that I'm going to be successful, if that can be there, I think there's no reason that she wouldn't go beyond. That's prayer. Yeah.
I wasn't sure.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So sort of in other words, according to these studies, teaching students to read in their first language promotes higher levels of reading achievement in English. Likely because, again, those skills and the knowledge that they develop in their first language that can transfer over to the L2 very readily. Now, well, and so just to kind of drive this point home, the implication here is that for a long time, we were using the word immersion as if like that was the gold standard of language learning. Like if you just get immersed in the language that you're trying to learn, that's the best way to learn a language. Immersion, though, sort of ignores this sort of body of research that says, actually having these supports and having the opportunity to develop literacy and these foundational language skills in your first language, either simultaneously or before a second language, has been shown to be much more effective in the long run in terms of skills in the second language. But you still hear, because again, that phrase immersion for a lot of years just seemed to be like the sort of method du jour of language learning. So people sometimes will still say, oh, we're putting them in this French immersion program. In fact, I have a friend who's a professor at a college in Canada. She teaches literature, and she says, in the Canadian system, they have parts of Canada that are French speaking, and she says, I have some students who are from English speaking households, but their parents were really impressed by this idea of sending them to these French immersion schools. So they did all of their like pre-K through 12 in French. And then, presumably they also have English because that was their home language and it's everywhere, Canada, whatever. But they get to university and she says those students actually, even though they have this very fancy education, have their writing skills, especially in English, are very poor. And I thought that was very interesting because it was actually sort of like an impact of privilege that their parents had chosen this fancy French school, assuming that their sort of English literacy, because that's their home language, would just sort of come. It would just sort of happen. And yes, they can read and write, but they're almost like that generation 1.5 in that they didn't have focused literacy instruction in their first language. And now their writing has sort of suffered for it in English. So it's not just, yeah, go ahead, Lisa. Yeah. But then I I've always liked them. And I was always reading and my first time was Urdu, and I can always when I think writing a little more challenging. I mean, in some ways, it goes back to this idea of fix and help, right? We talked about basic interpersonal communication skills and cognitive academic language proficiency. So fix is kind of everyday language that we use sort of conversationally and to go about the business of our life. This is usually how we learn our first language, is in fix. It does involve reading and writing, but it's usually everyday reading a text, reading an advertisement, reading menus, yeah, things like your mail that comes out, this kind of reading, writing for those kinds of things as well. But then how obviously involves much more sort of academic text, right? Reading more academic texts, articles, a lot of academic content around maybe science, for example, or social studies, or psychology, or any number of different disciplines. It involves writing in a much more complex sentence structure and a very particular kind of way you organize an essay or a research paper. Even the way that we maybe speak in the side of a classroom has a different sort of level of vocabulary and sentence structure than we would just with our friends outside of the classroom. And this is often not something that students have the opportunity to develop in their first language. That helps. So I'm not sure in terms of like your own sort of educational history, when you started learning English, or in which context or schools you were learning in Urdu and then in English, but it probably, when and where you were using either of those languages, probably impacted a lot what you can do in those languages, right? And the areas where you say, well, I'm fine with reading, but then speaking is more challenging. I'm good with listening, but writing is harder, that kind of thing, right? Yes, yeah, good question. She would say that the writing is actually much better in their second language. Well, although she doesn't teach it, but she's like, I think incidentally she would say, yeah, because they had, they did all of their high school in French, those skills are actually better than their English writing skills, right? So that's an unexpected outcome. Yeah, sorry.
For young learners, does that reading component affect that the feeling that we have that young learners will pick up the language easier? At least that belief. Am I ever being clear?
Let's say it again.
So I was thinking about the belief that we have that younger learners have, less effective filter, and so they pick up the language easier. When they are not experiencing literacy at this level, does that change that belief? Does it change their outcome?
I think that the thinking goes that it's not as if we wouldn't want to expose them to reading, let's say, or learning a second language in any of the skills we're trying to. I don't think that the thinking is, well, let's hold off and first only let them develop literacy in the first language. That being able to do that simultaneously is also like probably equally as good. But that doing the opposite, saying we're just going to bypass literacy in the first language because when they're young, they learn so quickly and well, and therefore let's get them going on this English right away. That thinking has been proven to be unhelpful, but I think that the research has indicated either sequential, so first language, then second language reading, or simultaneous. And that we'll talk, I think it's in a few slides, but the research is not, this research is very clear. It's not as clear on how long first language instruction continues to be helpful, right? So there's some thinking that says, like, some schools have, for example, a transitional bilingual program where they initially start, say, with first language in, say, pre-K and K, maybe. First language is like 90% of what we're doing, and we're only doing English 10% of the time. At first grade, it's more like 80% L1, 20% English in all the skills, literacy, math, etc. But that after about fourth grade, when they've got to about 50-50, then they start to transition them to fully English at that point. I'm not, again, the research is a little bit inconclusive on whether that's the right time. And if there wouldn't just be value to like a more what they call like a dual immersion or a fully bilingual program all the way through. To my mind, that's better. But I'm not sure if those decisions are driven pedagogically or just more in terms of resources, moving students over to giving them that foundation of literacy in their first language, but then moving them over to being an English class, right? Kind of pre-middle school. Just because that's resource effective, right?
Right. And you were saying they move so quickly. See, I was thinking, okay, we know this about those language learners. So why would we push them through? Why would we take that from them? Is the outcome for that second language really that great that they have to suffer both their L1 and their literacy? I'm like, have they stopped doing that? Did they shy away from doing that?
What might be a reason? Did anyone can think of why we wouldn't just always support first language literacy for all students.
Teacher resources, for sure.
Right, I think that that's it's not especially practical when you've got classrooms that have 10 different home languages. What do you do, right, in that equation? It may just not be possible for students from some home languages to provide that kind of first language literacy support. And that is why Goldberg goes on to explain that if it's not possible for these kind of resource reasons to give students that sort of bilingual instruction in their early years, well, then we know that what we know about good instruction and good curriculum in general for all pre-K to 12th grade students and even for adults as well. These things still hold true for English language learners. So he identifies these several bullet points of sort of, this is our second line of defense. I really do kind of both. These are not mutually exclusive, but these things make the K-12 classroom more effective for English language learners. Clear goals and learning objectives, especially when you take TESL 340 and do a lot more sort of practical creation of materials and lesson plans and this kind of thing. You'll talk a lot about reports that having really clear learning objectives and assessing those. What he calls meaningful, challenging, and motivating contexts. And that's sort of related to the idea of kind of like we talked about with comprehensible input in these rich environments with a lot of language. That's true of both language rich context and curriculum that's rich with content. So not avoiding teaching our students academic content from an early point in their language learning, not only sort of focusing on the pieces of language, but very much the idea of sort of content-based instruction, that students learn language best when they're not necessarily just learning it to learn the language, but learning it as a means to learning about science, learning about math, learning about social issues, etc. A lot of these that just kind of read to me like good teaching, right? So well-designed, clearly structured, and appropriately paced instruction. Active engagement and participation. So a lot of opportunity for students to be engaging with one another and using the language. Opportunity to practice, apply, and transfer the learning. Also feedback on correct and incorrect responses. The idea that correcting all errors and in the moment especially is not super helpful for language learners, but they do need some amount of feedback to know how they're using language correctly and where they're not necessarily, and there's really appropriate ways to do that. Periodically going back over a lot of material, recycling is actually super important for English language learners, giving them an opportunity to come back to material that you've already gone over. Frequent assessments of engaging students process so that we can reteach what's needed. And then again, opportunities to interact with other students, appropriately structured content. So a lot of it, honestly, like good teaching and group work. Group work's kind of always the answer, particularly for language learning students. Goldberg also writes that analysis of the research particularly supports instruction that combines what he calls interactive and direct approaches. So an interactive approach he defines as it involves some amount of give and take between the learners and the teacher, where the teacher is actively promoting students' progress by encouraging higher levels of thinking, speaking, and reading at their instructional level. So interactive approaches of teaching English language learners involve things in the classroom like structured discussions, structured meaning kind of specific topics that they should be discussing, and typically with particular roles given to each person in the group so that they all kind of have have a task or have a role that they're playing to contribute to the discussion, brainstorming kinds of activities, doing things like editing or discussing their own writing, or maybe even something that the teacher writes to be interacting with the text in that way. We also talk about direct approaches, which include explicit or direct teaching of skills or knowledge. So this is things like directly teaching kind of the pieces of language. So things like letter sound associations, spelling patterns in English, directly teaching vocabulary words, or even things that are not so much the pieces of language, but things like directly teaching math, like an algorithm, for example. Direct approaches like modeling, instructional input, corrective feedback, guided practice. I think these are not like opposites or mutually exclusive, but I think the difference is primarily that these are kinds of instructional approaches that involve getting students working together on kind of bigger pieces of language, in like kind of at the level of dialogue, whereas direct approaches are kind of look at smaller sort of parts of language, kind of a bottom-up approach, whereas it's a little more top-down. And he said that these two are much more efficient for English language learners than what we might call process approaches, like things like extended free writing time that don't involve a lot of direct teaching or structured learning, that those are less effective for English language learners in particular, than students learning in their first language. Not that no amount of those is possible, like I think it is actually really valuable to have students do some amount of journaling or free writing, but extended amounts of that, just sort of like without a lot of direction, tends to be less valuable in the long run for students developing their language skills. Which brings us to Wolfer's third point, that when instructing English learners in English, there tends to be this sort of double challenge that, like we talked about content instruction, students are both learning academic content and skills while learning the language in which those skills are taught and practiced. It's often the best way to be learning the language, doing that through content, but it's also sort of double challenging. And this kind of goes back to something that you were talking about a little bit, Star, in that in the early stages of learning to read, English language learners may make progress that's comparable to their L1 English students, right? So even students side by side, let's say in a kindergarten classroom, learning to read English, those students might be making comparable progress for a number of years. But as the content of their reading, as the academic content starts to become more challenging and the language demands increase, so things like more complex vocabulary, more complex sentence structure or syntax, usually around third grade, that is a point that they kind of hit where sometimes then you'll notice that English language learners start to fall behind their L1 years. Again, because they're both at that point learning a lot more complex academic content in a second language. So they're kind of having to do this double duty that the first language English students are not. And that's when we especially start to pay attention to the need for those instructional modifications to make that content more accessible and comprehensible for English language learners. And those modifications will include things like scaffolding, even at the sort of very beginning levels. So that can be things like speaking slowly and deliberately, using very clear vocabulary, clear diction or pronunciation, using a lot of pictures, a lot of realia or objects, a lot of movement to illustrate content. That's for sort of the very beginning levels. And again, at the very beginning levels, students may respond sort of non-verbally or other utterances. But even those fairly advanced ELLs, those kids who are in, say, third grade and who've been learning to read in English all along. Even they may require some modifications when, again, these more complex topics or something completely new or difficult are brought into the curriculum. Going back to this idea that that fix or conversational English, that can be learned in 2 or 3 years, but when we start developing health, that academic English, proficiency in health can take 6, 7, or more years for students to really develop that academic. So even, again, some of these kinds of modifications with using images, movement, sometimes bringing in first language equivalent where that's possible for key vocabulary, that can be really helpful for sort of helping students train for some of their content knowledge. Questions about just this kind of question of supporting English language learning in the pre-K-12 classroom and maybe the Goldberg reading. Does it make you think of things you've seen or things you've experienced?
I'm right now, I'm really focused on the modification component because I see more of the immersion or push in or pull out. And then there's not a lot of support practice at home. So as a teacher in those grades,
Yeah.
I'm like, okay, so where's one go? But modification.
Right. And that is, I mean, so even though we know that this sort of bilingual approach is sort of the gold standard, that's possible, again, in some schools where you have kind of a concentration of students from a single language background, Spanish, English, Mandarin, etc. It's not possible in all settings where there's just too many home languages. And so that's when we really have to focus in on the kinds of challenges that we expect our English language learner students will be experiencing, and then these kinds of modifications that we can offer. And this is a very basic kind of introduction to this idea. When you take TESL 340, you'll work a lot more specifically on, hopefully anyway, thinking about how do I modify content, how do I adapt, say, a lesson that I would teach to a classroom that will include both the English language learners and first language English students. And what can some of those modifications look like? Because 9 times out of 10, the things that you would do to support content learning for English language learners also benefits your first language English students. There's really no drawback to offering these things for all of your students. So then let's spend the rest of our time together today transitioning to returning to assumptions about language learning from light balance beta from the first week of this class. So I'll hand out this sort of questionnaire where you give your opinion about these statements. From strongly agree, agree somewhat, disagree somewhat, strongly disagree. There's a front and a back. And then we'll get into groups and talk about whether your thinking has changed on some of these things. And again, you might not remember exactly what you put on the survey, 2 months ago, but maybe some things will stand out to you as, I really kind of thought this way and now I changed. Or actually, I kind of knew this and I've only had this reinforced. So go ahead and fill that out.
Question.
Yeah.
Can I get that part? Too late, I got it first. No, I just don't my backpack is working.
You're done or almost done, even if you haven't finished every single question, that is okay. Let's get into two groups of four. Move down this way, or this way, however you guys want to do it. Two groups of four, and talk about ones that maybe you noticed that your thinking changed about, or ones that you feel especially strongly that you agree or disagree on. Ones that kind of stand out. We won't have time to talk through all 18 of them. So just talk about ones that are notable to you for those reasons. Either you've changed or you still feel very strongly one way or the other.
Whatever. I remember.
That's your, it doesn't have to, you can even ignore the word still. And if there's ones that you feel strongly disagree or agree about.
So, from what I can remember, I think so. I wish I
What do you
would
guys
have
think?
it.
Oh. But there's more to it than invitation. If you just do someone, you can do something. Maybe they're. But here's the thing, when we're repetition is like repetition. It's kind of when you imitate something. I had a friend imitated what he saw on TV. He didn't know what to say. He lived in Mexico because it was in English. He didn't know what he was saying. When I told him what he was saying, he felt really embarrassed. Yeah, but I would say that they're mainly through imitation. Yeah. Number 4. Number 4. What if we're number 4? No, I'm asking what you prefer number 4.
What number 4 even for that I
Strongly agree. Yeah, because if you're not motivated, it's kind of like I enjoy teaching myself Korean, but there was really no motivation behind it. So there were some days where like I tried to do the activities I proposed myself to do, but I would lose interest in it because at the end it's like, what am I doing with this? But it was a lot of fun. Like,
filter
huh?
when they said we learn if we're motivated, we're our focus.
Oh yeah, I see.
That's why I said strongly agree. And what was number 7?
I misread that. I strongly agree. Strongly agree. Because whenever you're reading something, you will always stumble upon words you don't know. Always. And you go to the dictionary, and the dictionary tells you what those words are.
I actually got all the words I don't know.
Yeah.
Would you
disagree. I disagree.
Really? But they would copy each other.
Yeah, because it's
I disagree.
easily anticipated.
Jim is this question. Because it depends on that's the thing. If you're doing someone when you're starting out, it's commonly to repeat after the one that knows the most. But after you keep going, you learn your own thing. So like I thought of it more of it like in the future as you keep going. Group activities are a great exercise because I mean they're great thing to do because you will always be there with someone that knows more than you. You'll always be there with someone that knows less than you. So that way it helps you learn more and more. It's not necessarily say that every time you work in a group, everyone's gonna be copying everything. Sometimes it does happen. I'm not gonna that's why I disagree. I certainly disagree. Because sometimes it will happen. But most of the times disagree. Disagree. That's starting.
What do you think? I think I agree with you. I kind of go with you saying that you kind of like even if we are we kind of learn new word and other words. I think we kind of focus on that. We do because we're learning.
Sometimes.
We're the young on the same level.
Eh?
All of you don't know.
I disagree. I disagree. I'll give everyone the benefit of the doubt.
The question is on something. The question is on general. That's why we're.
But that's the whole point of it, the debate. It wants to intrigue the debate.
What do you think? That's it for that one. Would you happy for that? I think
Hey, cool people disagree.
oh.
We're the cool people, I'm sorry.
Cool people.
No, too late. What were I saying?
I think we do. How is everything?
I agree, strongly agree. Strongly agree. So I don't know if they did this for you when they were teaching you English, but did they teach you math and English at the same time? So for me, I was learning how to do math and they were teaching me English at the same time. So you could do that. Same thing with science and history. They're teaching me how to do science and history at the same time. And that's how I get my, that's both. That's both.
What I remember who were talking, but like who are talking all the subjects. It's like yeah.
That means they're dumb. I mean, regardless, like even other years after that, I was in geography class, I was in science class with students who spoke only English and I still learned Spanish. So it's motivation, yeah. If the students aren't motivated by the subject, they're not gonna do well. Yeah. But even then, those students are really different.
So even if you started a very young, same thing of like, my son's elementary school, where they had like 1 hour every school day or something, they would have. I promise you that in many years, that kind of input with Spanish, he has zero. And, but yeah.
I put the same degree.
Well, I have this like, Spanish, really.
So-
But no, I mean, that little bit of input, and like the teacher truly happened to it.
Are you really gonna have a person English?
In the classroom, I'm like, this is not hard. Give me a break.
without an accent, perfectly.
So, yeah, those students started very young, but, they started at 10 years old and had daily Spanish.
You're crazy.
My sense is that would be much more valuable to them
And
than
that was
for
the-
younger without the kind of quality and quantity
Teacher,
that they were getting from a young age. Again, like students later can catch up quickly if it's high quality quantity and quantity. Almost.
Okay, so so you must have had a lot of experience with parents and friends. So how was it?
Oh, I actually, yeah, I have had to. I had to decide to be like, no, I'm not. I had to really decide. I'm never gonna talk to this teacher because I'm only ever gonna be that parent about this particular issue. Just like language teaching is my world, and you're bad. And whatever I would have said to this person clearly wouldn't have changed the structure of the program. Maybe she would have thought twice about doing it, but I think and I just was clear to me the outcomes will be different and I will just be better. So I will not, but I'm so my son is in high school now and he's taking Spanish this year and I'm constantly you doing your Spanish class? He's like, it's better. But but he's just at that age where he's like, I'm not fucking stop trying to get in my baby classroom. You're not welcome. But I'm very curious about what does it look like? What is it his class? What are his activities like? All this kind of thing. And he'll just be like, we just did some stuff. He doesn't know. He doesn't have language to describe. To him, it's like, I don't know. We're studying Spanish. And I'm like, oh, what are the activities? I'm trying to suss out. If they do a lot of grammar translation, because that's what it looks like in a lot of high school classes. Or are you actually involved in using Spanish in some capacity? Do you try to do interactive? I don't know. I don't know.
See, you're going at it the wrong way. I speak in Spanish.
Right, because then he was like, oh, there might be this opportunity to take this trip to Spain. And I was like, no, my friends.
Should be like,
You need to get another, I was like, you need another year under your belt, or that will not be a valuable experience yet. So I heard a little from each of these groups in the minute or two that we have left. Did anyone have an experience, did anyone learn something this semester that really changed their thinking about language learning? Or are any of these things something that you still feel really strongly agree or disagree about?
Yes.
Okay.
I learned that I suck at teaching myself a language.
Okay. And why do you think that was?
Well, management. But then again, everything was, as you know, I had a stressful semester.
Life stuff.
Personal
right?
life stuff. I think that affected it a lot. I believe that if I wouldn't have that much stress going on or stuff going on, I would have probably picked up Korean better than I did. Because I'll be honest, I didn't think I picked up any of it. The soap operas were really good though. So.
And with that project, again, the hope was never really that you would be able to develop a lot of ability in the language that you chose. More, it was a vehicle to help you sort of explore some of the ideas that we were looking at in this class around how do we think about language learning? How do we think about some of these principles and what they look like then in terms of activities? What works for me? What doesn't? And then to try and help have that as something that will inform your practice going forward as a teacher, having tried a new language sort of from scratch and not starting at sort of building on a foundation that you've already kind of had the opportunity to study under someone else's sort of methods, etc., but thinking about it kind of like as a new activity. So hopefully it gave you the opportunity to do that. It's also extremely dubious, the idea that you would teach yourself a language, right? As we learned, language is hopefully for communication, right? It's hopefully so that we can communicate meaningfully with others in a new language. And if you're doing that by yourself, it's not with others. So it's real hard, right? Very few people are able to do that super effectively. At any rate, thank you all for your robust participation in this learning journey this semester. I really enjoyed this particular class and the conversations that we've had and the way that you've engaged with these different ideas, the way you brought your own experiences of language learning. All of your experiences are very different, and I appreciate that way you contributed to this classroom. So thank you all. Good luck on all of your finals and your projects and all the things that you have coming. I'm still totally accessible to you. So reach out if you have questions, need anything in the next week or two or however. Then I wish you all the best. Thank you. And I hope to have you in a future semester. If I haven't.
I need some coffee.
And don't forget to do those evaluations. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
We can do that right now. Do you want to come to my office for this meeting?
Yeah, these are hilarious. I mean, I wonder when they put these up, and you look at that bulletin board and you're like, I I think it should just stay there like a time capsule.